They could rarely afford to penetrate inland with the men they brought, and any such excursion would have to occur on foot. Their boats, whose propulsion was limited by the whim of the wind and the depth of the water, could not easily or reliably sail on rivers. The result was an empire built on indirect rule and coastal trading depots. Early Sweden's approach was considerably different, because Sweden's regional geography was considerably different. The Danish island of Zealand kept the Swedish Vikings and later the Swedish Empire locked in the Baltic, a very small place compared with the oceans. There was no need for the Swedes to learn to sail when they could simply row. Instead of huge wind-powered vessels with small crews, the Swedes used small oar-powered vessels with large crews. The more men, the faster the vessel could go. Short trips meant less need for supplies. Whereas the British made landfall with small, scrawny, scurvy-ridden landing parties eager to trade, the Vikings made landfall with large, strapping warriors eager to satisfy more basic instincts. Because longboats have such shallow drafts, and because they were manned by lots of brawny Vikings, they could easily be rowed upriver and even portaged. Unique among the naval powers, the Swedes punched deep inland and even showed up as far away as Constantinople from time to time. This more direct approach is still reflected in Swedish strategy. Its military remains remarkably amphibious, and its defense industry depends upon no external power. Its economic relationships are direct and deep, seeking full ownership, in contrast to the Anglo preference of involvement via minority share purchases. But Sweden remains undeniably maritime, valuing trade and financial connections over the hardwired infrastructure and military links of land-based powers. Even now, 3 centuries after Sweden's grand defeat in the Great Northern War and its banishment to neutrality, the Baltic Sea remains a Swedish lake. Much of the world has forgotten this, but not Sweden's neighbors, because they were first raiding targets, then part of the Swedish Empire, and now part of the extended Swedish family, literally. Another culture that hasn't forgotten are the Russians, whose rivers are not particularly amenable to traditional maritime transport, but were perfect for the Viking expeditions of the previous age. The issue for the Russians and Germans isn't that Poland wants to be the brain and muscle of an anti-Russian and maybe anti-German intermarium, but that Sweden has every interest in making sure that the Poles succeed. Like Poland, the Swedes fear undue German or Russian influence regardless of the form it takes. And while Poland might have some difficulty spackling together an alliance, Sweden already has one. The familial relations of Viking and Imperial Sweden do not just include the weaklings of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, but also Finland, Norway, and Denmark, economically developed, culturally united, militarily robust countries that boast more than enough petroleum to supply everyone in the extended Swedish family, and Poland as well. By any measure, a Swedish-Polish alliance would be a mating of synergies. Sweden is an advanced maritime technocracy, while Poland is a modernizing land-based industrial power. Sweden has the money and technology needed to make Poland bloom, and Poland has the market to make it worth Sweden's while. And neither are in the Eurozone, so at least part of the European carnage to come will pass them by. Numbers will still prove a problem. There are under 10 million Swedes to support fewer than 40 million Poles against over 80 million Germans and some 140 million Russians. If Poland is to be successful, it will need more than simply Swedish help. Which brings us back to the Americans. The benefits of a Poland that can preserve its independence are undeniable. It would keep Central Europe out of either the German or Russian sphere of influence, and condemn both Germany and Russia to remain locked down in local issues. Unfortunately, Poland's case and its intermarium alliance is hopeless. Keeping Poland in play would require substantial commitment of technology, treasure, and in the end, likely even blood. It is exactly the sort of commitment that the Americans will try to avoid in the new era. If the Americans are to be drawn into continental European affairs, it will be via the Swedish vector. Sweden is no pocket power. Sweden has a stable economy, a tight circle of capable allies, a top-rate military force, and uniquely in Europe, a rock-solid financial system. The trick will be to manage and bolster Poland via Sweden so that the Americans can remain one step removed from the NEP. From the American point of view, Sweden makes Poland worth a second look. Poland will need that second look, because Warsaw dare not adopt a defensive strategy. It has no geographic barriers to hunker behind, and Swedish and American backing or not, it cannot possibly absorb and repel a German or Russian surge. For Poland to be independent, it has to somehow keep the competition away from its borders. The best way to do that is for the Poles to poke Ukraine as mercilessly as possible to keep the Russians off balance. Considering the Russian view of the importance of Ukraine, this is far from a low-risk operation. Should the Americans decline, the Swedes and Poles do have a fallback. Sweden nearly did not join the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons when it was negotiated in the 1960s, because Stockholm thought it would need nukes to dissuade Soviet expansionism. Its robust nuclear industry is both sophisticated and homegrown, and could construct a crude weapon in a long weekend. In this corner of the world, deterrence may not just be for superpowers. Scared New World. Life after Europe. Any of these factors could bring everything that matters in contemporary Europe crashing down. With such a melange of moving parts, something will have to give. What most of the world, and certainly most of the Europeans, have forgotten is that Europe has never taken a united foreign policy or security stance except under the direct, some would say domineering, leadership of the United States. With American economic and security guarantees on their way out, all options will be on the table, and something will give. In short, Europe is going to be a mess, and not the slightly amusing, organizationally dysfunctional mess that has been on display at most EU summits this past decade, but more of this seething cauldron of dislocation and war that it was in the 5 centuries before 1945. What is an existential challenge to one country is barely a passing concern to others. Lithuania, Poland, and Romania are in near panic about Russian activities in Ukraine, while Portugal, Italy, and Ireland insist that the real issue is the financial crisis. And Germany and the Netherlands are primarily focused on forging new trade deals with economies beyond Europe. There is no commonality, no agreement, and from that minimal coordination, Europe is becoming overwhelmed with itself. Within that rather dark and murky forecast, there is, however, one relatively bright spot. Not everyone in Europe took full economic advantage of Bretton Woods and branched out to become an international economic power. Not everyone handed over all meaningful levers of their defense policy to Washington. Not everyone in Europe is so enmeshed in the European Union that the Union's end spells utter disaster. And not everyone in Europe forgot how to have kids around 1965. One country has stood somewhat apart, and as such it will have less vulnerability and more options than the others. Irony of ironies, that country is the one that came up with the very idea of the EU in the first place. France. It shouldn't be a surprise. Just as Bretton Woods was America's strategic policy for fighting the Cold War, the EU was France's strategic policy for taking advantage of Bretton Woods. Alone among the major powers, Washington and Paris never hitched their economic systems to what were ultimately strategic gambits. France's economy is only half as dependent on exports as Germany's. It is among the world's foremost agricultural exporters. By European standards, it has a fairly healthy demography, still benefiting from a fairly robust birth rate. It is the only country besides the United States that floats an aircraft carrier worthy of the name, even if technical problems limit it to nothing more than brief regional deployments. Its use of nuclear energy keeps it largely independent of petroleum markets. What petroleum it needs, it can source from nearby Algeria, a country with which it enjoys reasonably positive relations. Its position on the western end of the NEP and its Mediterranean shoreline both reduces its exposure and widens its reach. Unlike Germany, where needs are legion and the places that can satisfy those needs are scattered, French needs are limited, and solutions to those needs are nearly all local. All of the violent chaos likely to erupt involving Sweden, Germany, Poland, Russia, Ukraine, and Turkey is on the far side of Europe. And just in case all else fails, it has nuclear weapons. Not can make them in a pinch like Sweden or South Korea, but already has them like the United States. Unsurprisingly, France is the country that the Germans take most seriously. Between its low needs and high leverage, France has not just the greatest capacity to shape Europe, but the greatest wealth of tools with which to do so. If there is to be some remnant of united Europe that will survive Europe's chaos to come, it will be France at its head. If there is to be some power that rises from the ashes as Europe tears itself apart, again, it too will be France. European history has been on hold since the Americans restructured the world in the 1940s. Centuries-old competitions were simply smothered under the happy blanket of American security and global trade. That era is rapidly coming to a close. In its place will be a host of states terrified of a reawakened Germany, a Germany that will have to fight for its economic well-being, a Russia desperate to harden its external boundaries, a justifiably paranoid Poland backed by a no longer neutral Sweden, and a Turkey eager to carve its own sphere of influence out of the EU's and NATO's remains. Will all of these evolutions result in wars? Probably not. But it truly would be stunning if none of them did.